All right, welcome everyone. My name is Tamar de Waal, and I'm a legal philosopher at the Amsterdam Law School, the law faculty of the University of Amsterdam, and I will be your moderator this evening. And this evening, we're going to have an event and a discussion and a conversation about this book. It's the new book by Timothy Garton Ash, who is here. Welcome. And the book is now translated in Dutch with the title Europa, een persoonlijke geschiedenis. And the title in English is Homelands, a personal history of Europe. Timothy Garton Ash is professor of European studies at the University of Oxford. For half a century, he's been reporting on European politics, witnessing some of the continent's most dramatic scenes and interviewing its protagonists. His pieces appear in The Guardian, The New York Times, The Standard and NRC, among many others. Europa is his 11th book. His book has received numerous awards and appears in 22 languages. Everything we have achieved in Europe is now at stake. That is the gist of the book, or as I see it, Europa. It is a personal history of a period of unprecedented progress and a testimony of what has gone wrong, from the 2008 financial crisis to the war in Ukraine. Drawing on a half a century of meetings, interviews, academic research, and his own family history, Garton Ash describes how the continent recovered after the Second World War, how it rebuilt, liberated and united at the beginning of the 21st century, and came close to an ideal of unity, freedom, and peace. But the book also asks questions about what do the European project and its values mean today, as war rages on the continent and the European Union is under great pressure. These are some of the topics that I hope will be covered tonight. The structure of the evening is as follows. First, I will have a conversation with Timothy for about 20 minutes, and then there will be a panel discussion with Caroline de Gruyter and Geert Mak. I will fully and properly introduce them later. So first, I invite Timothy to join me on the stage. Okay, well, first of all, congratulations with the book and also with the Dutch translation.
Thank you very much. You're amazingly quick. It came out almost before the British edition.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. Well, the book deals with an unlikely number of topics, so it would be impossible to discuss them all. So I will ask some general questions and also highlight a few anecdotes, moments, parts of the book. So first of all, this is a very personal book, I think. So there are many facts in it, many historical events, but also many personal thoughts and also personal details. For example, about your father, who was in the first attack wave on D-Day and arrived on the beach of Fères-sur-Mer. So my first question would be, why did you feel the need? That's the right formulation. Perhaps I should add, as an academic, to write such a personal book.
So, first of all, let me say what a fantastic pleasure it is to be here in this absolutely amazing building, and also to be in discussion with two of the greatest Dutch writers on Europe, with Geert and Caroline. That's really a huge pleasure. This book took just 50 years to write. One way of answering that question is that, you know, I've been traveling in Europe, studying Europe, living, breathing, writing about Europe, worrying about Europe for 50 years, writing it all down in little notebooks like this. Here's the latest one, Amsterdam. This evening will feature in this notebook.
Moleskine.
And at a certain point, I just thought, you know, this is a really extraordinarily interesting period of European history, and I can bring it home to readers because of this personal experience. In addition to that, and this is really the shape of the kind of story the book tells, I think we can all agree that Europe at the moment has a heap of problems, and that everything we've achieved in Europe over the last 50 years feels as if it's threatened. And that was the other motivation, which was, if you like, a political motivation. So the way I look at it, I started traveling in Europe in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, most Europeans were still living under dictatorships. We forget that.
We tend to forget
the Spanish,
that, yeah.
the Portuguese, the Greeks, the whole of Eastern Europe. We did the numbers for the book. 389 million Europeans were living under dictatorships, 289 million under democracies. And then you have this extraordinary, actually, forward march of freedom and enlargement of the West over roughly 35 years, through the ends of the fascist dictatorships in southern Europe, the end of the communist dictatorships, which is a very important part of the story, the collapse of the Soviet Union, southeastern Europe. And then I would say, starting roughly in 2008, we have what I call the downward turn. And starting with the global financial crisis, which segues into the Eurozone crisis, and Vladimir Putin's seizure of 2 chunks of Georgia, we have crisis after crisis after crisis, refugee crisis, Ukraine 2014, Brexit, Trump, COVID, now the largest war in Europe since 1945. And so there was a political impulse to writing to the book, which is, let's just understand how far we've come in Europe over the last 50 years, and let's get out there to defend it.
Yeah. And it's impossible to write that without some personal stories as well.
Well, I think people in this room might agree that, present company excluded, there are a lot of rather boring books about Europe. I don't know if people would agree on that point, on the EU. I once encountered the exceptions, of course, Geert and Caroline's book, that has to be said immediately. I once bumped into the writer Martin Amis at a drinks party, and he said, what are you writing about? And I said, the world's most boring subject. And he said, oh, you mean the EU?
He guessed.
But this is a book about the real Europe, which is, of course, the EU, but it's also 40-plus different countries, cultures, languages, places, people, above all people. So it's full of personal vignette, but each of which tells a larger story. So to give you an example, the day after the Berlin Wall comes down, I'm walking down a street in East Berlin, huge excitement, and I meet an East Berliner who says he'd just seen a handwritten poster which said, "Only today is the war really over." It's not just an anecdote. There's a real sense in which, for everybody in Eastern Europe living behind the Iron Curtain, the Second World War only ended in 1989. And so telling stories like that enables you to bring the reader in.
Yes, it's a beautiful part of in the book as well, I think. One question about the title. So the Dutch title is Europa. The English title is Homelands. Do you think something is lost in translation there? I'm
afraid it is. Everybody tells me the translation is terrific, but I'm very attached to this title, Homelands in the plural, because for me the unique feature of being a European is that you can be at home abroad, right? So I came this morning from London. I'm in Amsterdam, I'm abroad, but I'm also at home. And the same is true in Paris or Prague or Budapest or Warsaw. Nobody else has that. Poor old Americans only have one homeland, as in Homeland Security. Chinese only have one homeland. But that's a peculiar quality that we've achieved in Europe. And that's what I wanted to say with this title, Homelands in the plural. And it's very interesting now, there are now, I think, 18 European editions of the book being prepared, and seeing in which languages you can do homelands in the plural and which you can't. So, for example, in German, Heimat, you can't do it in the plural. It just doesn't work. But in French, patrie, yes, maybe, possible. The Italian edition will be called patria. So, but it says something very important. So it's not that Europe as such is a homeland. That's too much Euro pathos for me. It is that we're able to be at home abroad in other European countries.
And if I play the devil's advocate for a moment, do you think that's a widely shared feeling, that you're at home in all different European countries? Or do you think that it's also something that's true perhaps for us, academics or other groups in society? Or do you think that's something we all share in Europe?
Yes, including the most Eurosceptic Brits who have houses in Tuscany or Provence and feel very much at home abroad in Spain. So it's a much broader European experience, which is only possible. I have a chapter in the book called Being There, which is about the explosion of mass travel starting in the 1960s, right? So if you think of all the little cars like the Fiat Cinquecento or the Volkswagen Beetle and Golf or the Mini or the Deux Chevaux, they all date from that period because it was the first period when many Europeans were able to travel. For thousands of years before that, most people, most Europeans, had never been in another European country except if they were in an army or they had to emigrate because of famine. And suddenly millions of us were traveling to other European countries. So we had this lived experience of being at home abroad. And that goes way beyond what's your attitude to the European Union today.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, your book, I think, is also a political book, as you also already said. And the Dutch title of this evening is, it's also on the screen, Op de bres, voor Europa, which is also quite difficult to translate. But I would say it's something like defending Europe, in defense of Europe. And I think you also understand this book as explicitly defending Europe. And with that, do you mean the EU?
I do mean the EU, but it's defending a particular view of Europe. So in a way, the leitmotifs of this book are Europe and freedom. That's what matters most to me. And I'm happiest whenever Europe and freedom are marching shoulder to shoulder, as they did in the liberation of Spain, Portugal, and Greece, as they did in the liberations of East Central Europe. I'm unhappiest, and this does happen, when Europe seems to be clashing with freedom. For my father, who you mentioned, who landed on the first wave in D-Day and fought all the way through to northern Germany, where he occupied a village called Westen, which I go back to visit. It's absolutely fascinating to talk to the people there now who remember everything about that period. For my father, like many Eurosceptic Brits, Europe was counterposed to freedom. Europe was the threat to freedom. He would, if he'd lived to 2016, he would have voted for Brexit. For me, Europe and freedom march together. And I think for Spaniards and Portuguese and Greeks and many Central and East Europeans, by the way, for Ukrainians today. So it is absolutely a defense of Europe, but of a particular Europe, a Europe which secures our freedoms, defends our interests and our values.
Yes, but at the same time, this is sometimes, I think, misunderstood, perhaps. So you also write about the Brexit, of course, and
alas,
you write that it felt for you as if you lost a loved one.
Yeah.
So my first question is, how are you now?
I'm recovering. Thank you.
And the second thing is, how should we understand this Brexit, but also like the future relationship between the UK and the EU, also in light of your defense of Europe?
Yeah.
What happened there?
So first of all, I mean, when you say the loved one, let's not go over the top here, and it's quite difficult to love the Brussels institutions, but what happened is everybody knew that I was a passionate Remainer, and in the days after the vote, the 23rd of June, which you all remember, my continental European friends kept embracing me as if I'd lost a loved one. So it was as if I'd lost a loved one, and it was the biggest political defeat of my life. And I would say two things. First of all, don't make the mistake of thinking that this was just some English eccentricity. There was an element of English eccentricity on it. There were unique features, but about half the reasons that the Brits voted for Brexit are reasons that you can find in the Netherlands, in France, in Poland, in Germany. Geert actually writes about this in his second Europe book. You'd heard the same things in other parts of Europe. And you have your populists in this country, and you have your Eurosceptics in this country. So I think it's really important to look at those causes of Brexit, like the fact that, because this is also a book, there's no point in writing a personal history unless you're also self-critical. So it's also a book of the self-criticism of a liberal European. What did we get wrong? And one of the things we got wrong was that we were so focused on the other half of the world that we forgot about the other halves of our own societies. We turned our backs on the other halves of our own society. Sorry?
The other part of the world? The other half of the world, you said?
Yes, so we were looking outward. We were looking to Europe and then beyond. It was a period of globalization. The hope was that freedom and democracy would spread, and we neglected the other half of our own society. So there are a few lessons there which I think it's really important to bear in mind. The only good thing to have come sort of out of Brexit is the idea of levelling up, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the idea that we need to level up the poorer parts of British society, the post-industrial north that voted for Brexit. That's a really good idea.
So wealth distribution, basically.
Yes, but not just wealth, you see. Also, we thought it was all about the economy. But what populism has taught us is that culture is as important as economics. It's not just the economy is stupid. And so it's not just the inequality of income and wealth. It's also what I call the inequality of attention and respect. People in the post-industrial north of England or southeastern Poland or northeastern France just felt they were being completely ignored by liberal metropolitan elites. And, listen to us. As for the future between Britain and Europe, my God, I wish we could rejoin tomorrow. I really do, believe me.
It's a hashtag on Twitter, rejoin
Yeah, but
EU.
it's not going to happen. Let's not kid ourselves, because actually the politics are behind public opinion. So public opinion has now broken. Finally, after 6 years, there are clear majorities who say it was a mistake. That's very clear. But if you look at Keir Starmer, he's still spouting this absurd slogan, make Brexit work, as if it was a perfectly good idea, you just have to make it work, make Harakiri work. No, I'm sorry, no, because he's desperate to get the votes of those voters who voted, Labour voters who voted for Brexit. So it's going to be a gradual, incremental process. We have some more grown-up, sensible people in power now. Thank God we got rid of the Boris Johnsons. But it's going to be an incremental process. And I think what's going to happen is, I hope we can talk about this in the discussion, that sometime in the next parliament, so we have an election next year probably, towards the end of the next parliament, the question will be maybe customs union, single market, do we rejoin that? And then there'll be a debate about that. And then maybe someone will say, well, why be a rule taker when you could be a rule maker? Mm-hmm. So why not go the whole hog and come back in? So maybe in the 2030s, we will have a discussion about actually rejoining, but probably not before then. And if I may say, what I'd love you all to do is to make the EU so overwhelmingly attractive by then that a clear majority of the Brits will want to join. I'd love that to happen. I have to tell you, as a historian, I have my doubts whether that is going to be the case, because, as we all know, the EU itself has a heap of problems. It's not just Britain.
True. So in relation to Brexit, but I think also broader, I think your book communicates that when we try to understand history, we tend to understand things as if they were inevitable. Well, I think you advocate a perspective on history that we actually shouldn't fall for that interpretation, but that we should accept or understand that there's something like historical luck, but also that mistakes were made, and that things could have been very much different. Is that a good interpretation of me?
You've got it absolutely. Henri Bergson, the philosopher, talked about the illusions of retrospective determinism. The almost irresistible temptation to believe that what actually happened had to happen. So now looking back, it seems inevitable that the Berlin Wall would fall. Actually, it was the most, and I described this in detail, the most extraordinary example of what Machiavelli calls fortuna, historical luck. It was a huge convergence of circumstances that came to that. And, you know, if one of the questions of the book is, why did we go wrong and what went wrong? One of the answers is, towards the end of this 35-year period that I've been talking about, that's to say in the early to mid-2000s, when everything seemed to have gone so well for so long, we started believing that the way history had happened was the way history was bound to go on happening. In other words, I don't know if you can do this in Dutch, but we took history with a small h, the product always of conjuncture, of contingency, of chance, of choice, of individual leadership, and turned it into a history with a capital H, as in the Hegelian idea of history, as a process of the inevitable progress towards freedom. And so we started taking it all for granted and assuming that it would go on the way it was going. And of course, it's exactly at that moment of hubris, when we thought things were going to go on going that way, that they started going bad, and you get that whole sequence of crises. And that, you know, that's true of the Eurozone, it's true of Tony Blair's Britain and Europe, it's true of countries I care about a lot, Poland and Hungary, where we thought they are consolidated democracies, and they're in the EU, so that's fine, and they're going to be okay. It's true in spades of our relationship with Putin's Russia, right? Remember, we thought everything was going to be okay. We could go on taking our energy and trading with Putin's Russia, and history has taught us something different.
Well, you describe in the book that the period of beliefs in inevitability and also hubris are now over. And you describe several crises in the book. And I also saw an interview with you in which you described the war in Ukraine as a tragedy, a political turning point, but also as an opportunity for the EU. So we have all these different crises, democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland, the fences around Europe, migration crises, the war in Ukraine. Perhaps we can discuss that a bit more later. But in general, do you think these crises can all be potentially an opportunity for Europe? Will they bring us further together? Is that a possibility, or is it too optimistic?
So first thing to say maybe is that I think that the 24th of February 2022, the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, and remember, the war actually began in 2014. I mean, Ukrainians always remind us of that. It's actually been going on for 9 years. I think that brings to an end what I call the post-wall period. So you have the post-war period, post-45, and the post-wall period since after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the illusions of the post-wall period have hit the dust. So that I think we are probably in a new period. That's point number one. Now, as for the crisis theory of progress in European history, everybody at this point quotes Jean Monnet, that Europe advances by crises. But you know, if you look at it, the truth is sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. In response to some crises, you have a great forward movement, but in response to some other crises, you don't. I mean, I'm not sure that I could demonstrate that the refugee crisis, for example, actually generated a great forward movement of European integration. Rather the reverse. We actually started building more walls and more fences and had a renationalization. Ukraine 2014 didn't have that effect. So the question is this one different? And my hunch, but it's much too early to say, is that it is. Because it's just so big. I mean, the largest war in Europe since 1945. I've been to Ukraine twice in the last 3 months. I mean, it's absolutely shattering what you hear there. You know, when I started writing this book, I thought I must talk to people who still remember 1945, because we've got to bring home to people the hell in which this all started. Well, last month I was talking to people who just got out of Mariupol, who are actually experiencing this hell, and they're 17 years old, not 87 years old. And I think we all in Europe feel that it is just such a big event, such a traumatic event, a major land war in Europe that's been going on now for more than a year. And if you look at the EU's response, you know, it is actually quite impressive after a slow start. You know, Zeitenwende maybe remains still just a slogan, but everybody recognizes we have to do things differently. So that certainly that's my hope, that we shape up to this opportunity. By the way, an opportunity not just, you know, to take military power seriously again, to make sure we can defend ourselves, but I see a huge opportunity, and I'd love to discuss this here, in a new phase of the great eastward enlargement of the EU. You know, basically, we had this extraordinary, those 35 years were also an extraordinary, what I call enlargement of the West. 1972, 6 members only of the European Community, only 15 of NATO. Get to 2007, 28 members of the EU, 26, 27 members of NATO. I mean, extraordinary. And then it stopped. Basically, apart from Croatia slipping in and a couple of small countries coming into NATO, it stopped. And it stopped for about 15 years. And you know, poor old North Macedonia, anyone remember North Macedonia? Candidate country for EU membership in 2005, still waiting. It reminds me of a New Yorker cartoon which shows a businessman talking on the phone to some obviously rather irritating caller who's trying to get an appointment for lunch, and the businessman is saying, how about never? Is never good for you? And that was kind of what the EU was saying to the Western Balkans. And suddenly, since the 24th of February, this has become unfrozen, both for the Western Balkans, for Ukraine, for Moldova, even possibly for Georgia. Now, it's a hugely ambitious agenda. It's an agenda for 10 to 15 years. There shouldn't be a fast track, we shouldn't hurry it, but it's an enormously exciting agenda which at the end of the day would give us a richer, a larger, a more powerful and a more secure Europe. So there I see a big opportunity. Okay. But I think there may be some people in the Netherlands who don't entirely agree, possibly.
Some. Last question before we invite the other panel members on stage. So you've been to Ukraine last week or last month for a week?
Last month, yeah.
So can you perhaps tell us a bit about your experience?
So I arrived, like everybody else, on the train, immediately into an air raid. So I spent the first 4 hours in a bomb shelter. It's actually the first time I've given a university lecture in a bomb shelter. There was extraordinary stories of suffering, as I mentioned, people who, you know, the 17-year-old from Mariupol who'd seen things that a 17-year-old should never, ever see, people who'd lost relatives in the war, talking to wounded veterans. There was people divided from their families. There was all that side of suffering. But there was also extraordinary courage, determination, solidarity, and hope. And I'll tell you what it reminded me of. It reminded me of what 1940 was for Britain, a moment of great national peril, but also a moment of great national pride, standing alone. and a moment that defines your country, not just for decades, but even for longer periods to come, right? So that our self-image, British self-image of ourselves, is absolutely defined by that moment, by 1940. And 2022 is that to Ukraine. So in a way, it's also, and it sounds an odd thing to say, although it's a traumatic and drastic situation, it's also a hopeful moment. And there was a great deal of hope there. And for them, you know, it's now all about Europe. It's about getting as far away from Russia as possible in ways, you know, Pushkin Street in Kiev has been renamed because he was a Russian writer. We may feel uneasy about that. I said, why rename Pushkin Street? He had nothing to do with Putin. They said, it's not an accident. There's no Shakespeare Street, there's no Molière Street, there's no Goethe Street. It was an imperial statement, Pushkin Street. This is a war of decolonization. We want to get just as far away, stop talking Russian. In a bookshop where they're pulping Russian language books, they told me touching stories. Old ladies in Kiev come in who basically are Russian speakers, but now they want to speak Ukrainian. And so they, can you give me something simple to read in Ukrainian? And so they give them children's books in Ukrainian. It's really touching, because they want to read something in Ukrainian. And it's all get away from Russia and get as close to Europe as possible. So it's all about being on the track to Europe.
Thank you. So we now invite the panel members on stage. I will sit here so you can sit next to each other. So first, Caroline de Gruyter. She's been writing about Europe for over 20 years, including from Brussels and Vienna. Oh, you can applaud. She is a columnist and correspondent for NRC Handelsblad and also publishes in the Standaard and Foreign Policy, amongst others. And she wrote a book in 2021, Beter wordt het niet, and it's a journey through the Habsburg Empire and the European Union. And Geert Mak is a non-fiction writer and journalist, wrote many famous books, amongst others De Eeuw van mijn vader, In Europa en Grote Verwachtingen. And his work appears in more than 20 countries. And Mak received numerous awards, both in the Netherlands and abroad, and also made successful TV programs. So indeed, what we in the Netherlands have the most expert panel you can imagine, Timothy. So Caroline, you wrote the blurb on the Dutch book. So could you tell us what you thought of the book Europa?
I loved it. Why? Because usually books about Europe are unreadable. I mean, it's those of us who... can you all hear me in the back? Okay. Those of us who deal with Europe and the European Union and the institutions every day get perhaps a bit further in all these difficult books about Europe. But this one is personal. And I really had the impression that Timothy had just thrown everything out of the window, had sat down and thought by himself, what do I really want to say? Well, Europe is a different thing for everybody. It depends on geography, it depends on age, it depends on so many factors. And so he showed actually what a mosaic, a kaleidoscope it is. And that's what I loved about it. It's really, it's a terrific read. Yeah. And then, you know, he's a professor after all. So, you know, but the theory is all hidden under the table, but it's there. But you get it for free, and you don't even notice it. I think it's great. It's a super read. It's your best book, I think.
Okay. Geert, I'm going to ask you the same question. So,
yeah, I agree totally with what you're saying. It is a living book. And it is not, Europe is often Brussels and often there's theory and dry rules for a lot of people. And I would only say when you have a friend who's complaining again about rules and about Brussels and the Holstein War, give him or her this book. This is certainly about how Europe is, and indeed Europe has so many faces, and that is also part of the dynamics of Europe, and that makes him also so interesting. And it is also a struggle, and you feel that very well in this book through time. When you compare it with the United States, it costed, I think, the United States of America about 130 years, 140 years, I think, around the First World War, that it at last became one country. All those different states, at the end, there was really something togetherness, and there was a civil war needed. So Europe, it is totally different, but in somehow it is the same process. And so it is a book which makes me also happy, because you think we started really from almost nothing, from a war, and more and more you see Europe growing under your hands. So thank you.
So one of the things that Timothy writes is that Europe is a continent that constantly starts over. So in Dutch, the sentence is, in Europa is nul een repeterend getal. So I'm not sure what the English translation would be, but 0 is a repeating number, or keeps returning?
0 is a recurring number.
Recurring number.
Shall I explain the argument?
Yes.
Yeah. How many people are familiar with this idea of year 0 or Stunde Null? Do you have that concept in Dutch? Yes? So the idea that 1945 was year 0. And what I say is, actually, in Europe, 0 is a recurring number. And this thought came to me when sitting in an editor's office in Sarajevo in 1995. And the editor was very cold, and so he was feeding the office furniture into a stove to keep us warm. So a chair leg would disappear into the office stove, and then another chair leg would disappear. And at one point he said, but you know, after the war. And I automatically thought he meant after 1945. And then I realized he meant after 1995. That was after the war for him. So year 0 was 1995. And now, if you think of Ukraine, after the war is going to be 2024, 2025. And so for me, one of the things we're constantly trying to do with the whole European project is to stop Europe going back to its bad old ways. Because if we don't have all these structures of cooperation and collaboration and conflict management, if everyone Brexited, then sure as hell other countries would go back to their bad old ways, and we'd have other year 0s.
So it would mean we're in a new phase now. I think we all agree on that. So in a way, this is again point 0. So is this something that happens automatically, or do we need now to work on Europe? Do we need new stories,
it's in
narratives?
full swing already. It is in full swing. I remember attending a lot of conferences, you know, in the past 10, 15 years, all over Europe, with about themes like a new narrative for Europe. Yeah. And I used to say, you know, it's bullshit. Our narrative is so incredibly strong. You're not just going around making up a new narrative just because the young in Europe have never witnessed a war. So now we see how useful or how relevant the old narrative is. And I think, I came back after 8 years, having lived in Vienna and Oslo, and then I came back to Brussels last year. Brussels had completely changed. Everything is about security. Many decisions are taken, you know, with the speed of light. We managed to give, yes, the migration debate has not moved. Well, it's moving now a little bit for different reasons, because the East gets experience with refugees. But we arranged their status in 5 days. I mean, it's incredible. We're talking about defense now. We have to. we're doing our regular business, agriculture, trade, transport, in a different way, because everything is about security now. So we look at the same ordinary business we always did from a totally different angle, and that changes everything.
But do you think that necessarily leads to the Europe and freedom that Timothy aspires? Or do you think perhaps this new frame of security can also go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think that is reformulated now because Russia attacked Ukraine. You know, the reason why enlargement was stalled is that we all thought that the EU was, you know, that's what I learned at school at least. You know, it was a market, it was good for Philips and Unilever. Well, they've all left now, I think. Left the Netherlands at least. But now it turns out it isn't. And enlargement has stalled because of fatigue. You know, we didn't see the use actually anymore, the strategic, the geopolitical use. But now we do. Ukraine is reminding us that, I mean, it's a political discussion all of a sudden. And it's not a discussion about, are there abattoirs actually ready to be integrated into the European rule system? How many square meters of tiles an abattoir, slaughterhouse has to have? All this is European law. Huh? Mm-hmm. No, it's a political decision now.
Don't you both think, because it feels to me that there was a way in which, with the war in Ukraine, people suddenly said, yes, this is what Europe is really about. This is really what we have to defend. Yeah. And they're fighting and dying for Europe. And it gave an extraordinary... You remember Heraclitus says, war is the father of all. And there's a sad truth in that.
But as I think also it was a feeling. This is about us. And I see now, and perhaps you have that too, and there are a lot of people sitting here too. Now we have also to think and to discuss why it's this. The feeling is right, but what is our identity exactly? And we have to think about this feeling too. And on the other hand, we have also, I think, a part of the European identity was always the compromise, dealing, soft power. And of course, since the 24th of February last year, that has changed. Suddenly, we have also to use hard power. And I see a country like us, Netherlands, have really to get used to it and to have to reorganize the army, and our army is really almost now it's not much, in fact, and we have really to make a big change of mind, and sometimes I'm a little bit sad because this old European soft power was also for a long time really very effective, did it very well. We could keep France and Germany had every generation there's a war, and suddenly after 45 it was gone. So I hope we are really Europe is in a totally new area and in a totally new mood, but I hope we can keep also some of the old values. And it's not only liberal values, it is also the values of, how can I say it?
But isn't it about values now? I think it's very much about values. Also because of the war.
But I mean also the value of compromise, of dealing, of tolerance, and so on, and so on, and so on. But the soft power instead of next to the hard power.
Yeah, Timothy,
but
do
don't you think that
risk?
one way to think about that is that, I'm not sure if soft power is quite the word, but compromise and so on, that's a great virtue internally, right? And so you need a combination of that softer kind of power internally, but hard power when you're faced with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Iran, so that Merkel's mistake, and we should talk about Angela Merkel, because I think, you know, with hindsight, history is not going to be so kind to her, was that she applied those same methods externally as internally.
Yeah.
Having said all that, I don't think Europe will ever be a hard power. But it has to understand, and it starts to understand, how hard power works. When it, you know, we were a soft power, thinking that if we were soft, the others would treat us softly too. Yeah. We never really thought about the question, what happens when somebody attacks us? And we have completely deconstructed, because almost all of us did, our armies.
So when you say you don't think it'll be a hard power, I take it what you're saying is that we're never going to be, as it were, a superpower in the Gaulleist sense, that Europe being able to defend itself, which I think is absolutely right, because it's really interesting. If you look at public opinion on the Ukraine war, actually European countries have come closer together over the last year. We did some polling, my project at Oxford did some polling with ECFR, which showed that Polish and German public opinion are actually quite close together. Why is that possible? Firstly, because most decent people have the same reaction to a war of terror and genocide in Ukraine. But secondly, because we're doing this with the United States, not against the United States. So my argument has always been, you will never unite European public opinion against the United States. Look what happened with the Iraq War. But if you're doing it as a partner of the United States, then you can actually have a united European public opinion. And so I think we could have an element of hard power, but understanding that our security will still depend on the United States.
I think a multinational entity, because we're not a state, although we have all the characteristics of it almost, can never be a total hard power. Because to be a hard power, you have to be able to wage offensive wars too. Yeah. And we cannot, because you need all the noses in the same direction. A defensive war, like Ukraine, I mean, we have no boots on the ground, but we're helping Ukraine. That puts our noses in the same direction.
Okay, but let me
a defensive war, yes, but offensive, no.
So let me try on you, all of you, a little thought/provocation. Maybe Europe needs to become a kind of empire.
It is an empire.
Right. Well, I'm glad you weren't provoked.
A benevolent one.
Because you know, if Ukraine manages to win this war, then we will have for the first time what I would call a post-imperial Europe, a Europe without empires run by one country, overseas or on land. But to defend our interests and our values, the EU itself has to become a kind of empire. So you have supranational authority and law and power. When you deal on trade with Europe, Europe is very much an empire. And now we have something called the European Peace Facility, which is funding ammunition for Ukraine. So I think we have to sort of understand that. And interestingly, I had a conversation with the foreign minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, in Kiev last month, who said, yeah, we want to join your liberal empire, but it's a different kind of empire. It's not by use of force, it's an empire by consent and by law.
But I think also we Europeans, we have to still to learn, and now we learn it very fast this year, to operate as an empire. Because perhaps we are a small country, we are not used to it. I think the British, you are used to it, to think in that way.
We didn't make a very good job of it, I have to tell you that.
But we Dutch and a lot of European countries cannot think, or it is still difficult to think in that way. And I agree totally with you. It is not only because we have to defend ourselves and the way of our existence and our values and so on and so on and so on. It is also because we have our own place in the world. And that makes it complicated. For instance, the relation with the United States, I think, can be more complicated coming years. And we have really to find our own way in, for instance, in the China-United States discussion and conflict. So And I think it is, we learn it, and we have to learn it, but it will take time.
But that means we have to define our interests, our common interests, better than we've done so far. Our foreign policy, our security policy, are not European, they're intergovernmental. So we need more integration in those fields. We need also to be able to stand up and say, this is in the interest of Europe, this is not in the interest of Europe. We have to learn to speak that language.
But don't you think, both of you, don't you think that what we have at least partly succeeded in doing is creating a kind of shared European strategic culture? So we're all involved in the European Council on Foreign Relations, which set out more than 15 years ago to do that. And, you know, actually, if you have a conversation about Ukraine and Russia in Italy or in Spain or in Sweden or in Poland, it's a similar conversation. So in our different languages, we do have a kind of shared strategic culture. It's when push comes to shove and the government is trying to get the contract for its steel maker or its arms manufacturer rather than another, that you come up against hard national interest.
Or member states are actually now cutting the budgets of European diplomats.
Yeah.
So they're asking more Europe in the foreign policy and security field. Yeah. At the same time, the budget of the EAS is cut with 5%. No. I mean, explain that. This is not an empire behaving.
Well, it's a rather weak empire.
It's a very weak empire behaving.
Another topic. So Timothy, in his conversation with me, said that to a certain extent, European countries, including the UK, has neglected parts of its own population, that it was so much busy and focused on the other side of the world, other parts of the world, that it's forgot its own population, its own internal issues. And perhaps Brexit, one of the reasons behind Brexit was that. We now also discuss a lot of political, and international issues. But at the same time, we have internal issues as well, of course. The ones we just mentioned, but also the rise of the radical right, things like that. So do you think that in this new phase of Europe, there will be enough attention for that? Or are we again overly focused on the international relationships?
Question to me?
Thank you.
We're never enough focused on that because it's always tight ropes for the leaders of all the member states. They do things in Brussels and then they come home and have trouble explaining it. And sometimes they don't explain anything and they just blame Brussels for it. So, and then we have had the pandemic, now the war in Ukraine. It's, I mean, it costs us a lot. It costs us, the heating gets more expensive, we have inflation, and so on. And this is probably going to last for a while. The world is changing and we are paying a price for it. So yes, I think our governments will have an increasingly hard time explaining certain choices that they make in Europe together to the people. I mean, I was in Paris just a few days ago, and I think most of the French understand that the pension system has to be reformed because it's becoming totally too expensive. And we're all in the euro, so the pressure is not just from the French government or the French finance minister, but the pressure is coming from Germany, from the Netherlands, from other Eurozone countries, like, hey, watch out. They know all this, but at the same time, they don't like the way Macron pushed the law through, and they don't like the law either. So some of the streets in Paris were there were street battles. So yes, it's difficult. It's always.
But isn't it wonderful that France still wants to recreate the French Revolution.
Yes.
After more than 200 years, they still want always to replay the French Revolution. It's very funny, most academics I know fiercely resist having to retire at 68 or 70, and the French are on the streets in order to continue to retire at 62.
Well, the sad thing about it is that, the generation before us, they went on the streets in 68 because they wanted to have a better life than their parents. And now the young people go into the streets. There were students occupying lycée, teenagers today in schools all over France, and they want to keep what their parents had. It's not looking forward, it's looking backward.
But if I just quickly to your question,
yes.
One of the things populists rather skillfully do is to say the nation against Europe and democracy against liberalism. So Viktor Orban, who plays a large part in my book, is the most skillful politician in post-communist Europe. He does this brilliantly. He says, I am standing up for the nation against this horrible Europe over there, and I'm standing for democracy against this conspiracy of liberal elites. And so, I think we, if I can put it this way, pro-Europeans, made a big mistake in leaving talk of the nation to the right. I think we should have talked more about the nation. After all, if you go back to 1848, liberalism and patriotism went hand in hand, right? And so we shouldn't leave, we should also say, like Macron does, there's no contradiction between these two things. It's not Europe or the nation, it's Europe and the nation, en même temps. And it's not democracy or liberalism, you have to have the two together.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And now there is I think it is not only the nation. We see it here in the Netherlands, of course, with this Farmers' Party. I think it is also when the society is changing very fast and the problems are more and more complicated, people love simple solutions. That's the basic of populism. But they feel also alienated from things at home. For instance, I think in France, and you saw it also in Great Britain, for instance, when I traveled there and talking to people, they come often back to the time, let's say 30 years ago, there were still trade unions, there were parties, you had fun. It was a kind of a family. Politics was also a kind of family life for generations long. And that is totally, the whole system collapsed. So Europe is full with voters who don't feel, they don't feel at home themselves. The English title is really very good, very good. And I think it is a big problem and also a task for politicians to bring this feeling back a bit and also to explain Europe to the voters and to, I see here in the Netherlands and a lot of, it is special, perhaps more Dutch than, for instance, in Belgium, I feel much more European feeling also among the national politicians. Here I follow discussions in the parliament and they talk a whole afternoon and I think, this is Brussels. That is the place where the discussions, the decisions are taken already in Brussels. I have often the feeling, like you sit in a carousel, you see little boys with a car, with a small car or playing that they have power. But the real power is in Brussels. And the decisions are taken in Brussels. And I think it is a task for national politicians also to say, this is our work, we do that, but that is Brussels. And our representatives and in the European Parliament made that decisions or will make that decision. So I think a lot of good things in Brussels are brought here by national politicians with the air. We are doing it, we did it, and when something goes wrong, it is Brussels. And I think also we have really to stop this play, and because
More honesty in that regard.
we have to be more honest, really,
It's a
much
matter
more
of
honest.
responsibility, of course, because it is a responsibility they take. The Farmers' Party, they were talking about nitrate levels determined by Brussels, and those are European rules, and so we should abide. Yeah. But nobody says that, actually we decided on those rules. These are our rules. Yeah. It's our ministers, and maybe even our prime minister, I can't remember, I think it was ministers, who decided on that. It's not just, it's EU, we're part of the EU, so we have to follow those rules. No, it's our rules. We made our elected people decide it.
And a little
it's
bit
a matter
more.
of responsibility.
That is, Brussels is also, with a lot of, it took a lot of time, but more and more, it's also a living democracy. And really, it becomes something, and I think the national, I repeat myself, the national politicians have more and more to be more honest and to translate Brussels to the national political area. Yes.
That's if I may again, I have the feeling, I came to Brussels first in 1999. We had a lot of pages in the newspaper on Europe, we had lots of correspondence at the time. But I think people were not really interested. Now there's a lot of interest. It's people feel that there's something happening in Europe and that it is, and they want to know what it is. They're not sitting and waiting. You work a lot with students, with young people. I'm sure you have the same experience. I think this new generation is very political.
Yeah, but I just slightly differ. I agree with everything you both said, but one of Brussels' problems is that politics is also theatre, right? People have to relate to these actors on the stage who are playing out a drama in The Hague or in Paris or in Berlin. And Brussels is not good political theatre, right? There are not characters we clearly identify, the roles are not clear, and they're not great actors. And by the way, also they're speaking in different languages, which is a problem.
The debates
because,
are unwatchable.
Theatre in a foreign language is much more difficult to follow. So I think there's a kind of intrinsic difficulty there. And actually, what that means to me is, I think Ursula von der Leyen has done a remarkably good job on the Ukraine war. That has defined her presidency, and chapeau, honor to her. But,
and the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but even more, I think, on the Ukraine war in terms of really going out ahead, because they had a slow start on the pandemic. But of course, as you know very well, one of the problems is that our national leaders don't want to put really effective politicians and communicators in the top jobs in the EU institutions because they don't want to be, outclassed and outplayed. So that actually, I think in the next period of the Commission, if we could only persuade national leaders to put some really major figures and great communicators in there, that would make a big difference.
It's a fight about the theatre and a fight about the stage.
Yeah, whereas, of course, I joke in the book, the one thing all Europeans have in common is America, because we all know who the players are in Washington, and we all follow the political theatre.
Timothy, this is changing a bit. I remember early 2000s, Romano Prodi was Commission President. I went to the new IKEA in Brussels on a Sunday. It rained, of course. And in comes Romano Prodi, little Italian man. Nobody turned around.
He wasn't that little, come on.
Nobody turned around to look at him. And you have to zigzag through the entire building. So I followed him just to see what the response was. None. He paid for his billy. Now, if you would let Ursula von der Leyen loose in Brussels IKEA, I think everybody would recognize something has happened.
Okay. I can match that story because I had dinner with Romano Prodi when he was president of the European Commission. And he said, I've booked in a very nice little restaurant. The booking is in my name. So I got to the restaurant a little early, and I said, there's a table in the name Romano Prodi. And they said, who? I said, Romano Prodi. They said, who? And so I got the worst table in the restaurant. Nobody recognized him when he came in. So, yes, something is changing.
So, time flies. Last question. So, in the book, Timothy says that he explicitly defends Europe. Or maybe not so much in the book, but it's clear that the book explicitly defends Europe. Geert, do you also in your work, given the current times, do you feel the need to be an explicit advocate of the EU and Europe?
Oh, that is a difficult question. Deep in my heart, yes. Yes, but I'm a journalist. And when I think when something is going wrong or is wrong in the European Union, then I have to write about it. For instance, in the triumphalism, we didn't talk about it, the triumphalism in the beginning of the century, with all these half constructions. The euro is a half construction without a common financial system. The Schengen is a half construction without open borders, without a common immigration. I have criticized that a lot. Also, because your hope, my hope is that it will improve, of course. But yeah, deep in my heart, and it's not only. I think it is the only way to survive, honestly, in this century. That we are somehow are together and to live together and to fight together. That is a change since the last, in the 70s, you can talk about idealism, and in the 50s especially, no more anymore, no more anymore. But now we have to survive together.
Caroline, very briefly, do you feel the need to really defend the EU?
No. I think there's no need. I think the EU can defend itself. It's not my job either. But what my job is to look at the beast and try to describe it. And it's changing all the time, so it escapes me all the time. And once you sort of pinned it down, then something happens and it reacts and it changes again. And that's what I'm describing. But in describing it, I'm not asking myself every day, should this exist, should this not exist, which is what some people do.
Yeah.
And furthermore, I think the best critics of this half-baked project, the best critics are in Brussels. Those are the ones who work with, in a half-baked...
They're aware, you mean?
Yeah, they know exactly what is wrong with it, and I mean, in different ways, and what could be done, in an ideal world.
Yeah. Timothy, last question for you. What do you hope this book will do? What's the ambition?
I hope it will be read. That's the first thing. And I hope people will see what an extraordinary story the story of Europe is over the last 50 years. And just how interesting and exciting and diverse and rich this Europe is. It's not just Brussels and the European institutions. It's more than 40 countries, cultures, languages, people, places, events. And that's the real Europe. But having said that, to circle back to your question, I think our job as historians or as journalists is simply to seek the truth and then to tell it as it is. That's basta. That's our job. But I think it's true to say, adapting Winston Churchill, that this is the worst possible Europe apart from all the other Europes that have been tried from time to time. And so I think in telling the story entirely honestly, we can also say, hey guys, we've really got something here. Don't let's throw it away.
Okay. So there are many, many topics that we have not discussed which are in the book, which I can very much recommend to read. There is now some room for questions from the audience. I believe there will be a microphone. I do want to emphasize that there's no room for mini lectures, so only questions, otherwise I cut you off. So, the mic is here. Is there someone? You have to walk to the mic, please. So, only questions.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have a question. In 1989, the wall fell relatively unexpectedly, I would say. The same could happen in Moscow. How should Europe prepare?
So, unexpectedly, Moscow could fall right now. That's the question. How should Europe be prepared if that would happen?
So, you're absolutely right that we don't know what's going to happen in Moscow, and we shouldn't kid ourselves either that we know, that we can predict, or that it depends on us, because it doesn't depend on us, it depends on internal developments. But we should defend ourselves. We should help Ukraine to defend itself, and we should be ready to respond when political change in Moscow comes. It could quite easily get even worse before it gets better. So we have to be prepared for a Mr. Prigozhin coming to power, but also for a Mr. Navalny or someone of the Navalny persuasion. And I think it's really important that we always remember that Putin is not Russia and Russia is not Putin, despite the fact that his people say he is, and that we have to find ways to keep communicating to ordinary Russians that our quarrel is not with them, it's with Putin and his war of aggression. So, for example, I have a project at Oxford, and we have a number of partner universities. We have a Moscow University as a partner. We came under pressure to cut the ties. We haven't cut the ties. I'm not going to punish 21-year-old Russian students for Mr. Putin's war against Ukraine. So I think that's one very important thing we can do to keep the lines of communication open to the people who may one day actually create a better Russia.
Are there other questions? Yes, in the back. Please walk to the mic.
Thank you. It is mentioned in the report that Hungary and Poland were consolidated democracies after 1989, and you talked about Viktor Orban as well. And I would like to ask you, how would you explain to the supporters of Viktor Orban that the EU actually works in their favor and does provide them with democracy and freedom for survival, and not just in the political sense, because many of these people after the transition could not enjoy that political freedom because of the rapid economic changes that contributed to 6 million premature deaths in the region at that time.
So I didn't hear it acoustically. Did you hear it?
So the whole question or a part?
The last part of the question. The first part was about Hungary and Poland.
Yeah, so it's not only about the political sense or realm, it's also because these people not always can enjoy their political rights and political freedoms because of the economic changes in these countries. So it should also be important that Europe, in a broader sense, is useful for these people, that they feel as if they profit from it.
Yes, I mean that during the transition there was a very quick privatization, regulation. But during that time, these people were told that there is no alternative, and that after the hardships, there would be prosperity in the European Union, and they couldn't really experience it.
Yeah, thanks. I've got the question. It's a great question. So here's the thing. There were thousands of books written about how you make the transition from capitalism to communism. There was no guidebook for how you make the transition from communism to capitalism. There was no private property, there was no rule of law, there was no civil society, there were no free media, there was nothing. The joke was, we know that you can turn an aquarium into a fish soup. How do you turn a fish soup back into an aquarium? So they did it in this crude, unfair way where a lot of bad people got very rich very quickly. The net effect was that the economies grew quite fast, but there were a lot of losers from the transition, and they were often people like workers who'd supported Solidarność in Poland, who ended up still living in grotty one-bedroom apartments in Gdańsk, while former secret policemen were millionaires in Warsaw. So there was a deep sense of injustice about it. It's very hard to see how that could totally have been avoided, because nobody knew how else to do it. The mistake was made by my friends, the liberals and Democrats in countries like Poland and Hungary, was that they didn't see that and address the problem and have a much stronger social policy for the losers from the transition sooner. And because they didn't, people like Viktor Orban or Jarosław Kaczynski could come along and say, we're the guys who will see you, we're the guys who are going to help you. And they did this trick where you have a right-wing nationalist cultural and foreign policy with a nationalist rhetoric, so everyone feels good about that, and a left-wing social and economic policy. So it's a very important point, but I think the flaw is not so much in the initial transition, but in the failure to address the suffering that it caused.
If you have a question, please walk to the mic.
This microphone is horrible. Can't hear anything.
Oh,
Whoops.
be careful.
I have two questions. I have the misfortune of having spent a lot of my life in South Africa, so homeland has the very good boundary status for me. Europe has its inside and its outside. What in the values of Europe is not going to lead Europe to just become a bubble of privilege in a world that's exploited? What's going to stop Europe from becoming a bastion for capitalism in a world that can be exploited from within Europe? That's the first question. The second question is directed to Caroline. She mentioned the strikers in France. It's almost every country in Europe, 30% of gross domestic product goes to capital. In the 1970s and 80s, it was 10%. Why has that become so natural that we can't, there's no money anymore to pay for pensions, to pay for social provisions? Is part of Europe's value providing capital with those sorts of super profits?
So the first question was for Timothy, I think.
So you've asked what for me is one of the most difficult questions of all. Because if Europe is anything, it's a universalist project. We believe that our values are universal and not just parochial. And what we have done is to remove the Iron Curtain running through the middle of Europe, and instead we're building an Iron Curtain around the edge of Europe. So I describe in the book, I don't know how many of you know, there's a Spanish enclave on the north coast of Africa called Ceuta. Ceuta and Melilla, there are only two bits of Europe in Africa. And because it's in Africa, it faces all the migratory pressures from the rest of Africa. And they have built a double fence with barbed wire and all the modern border controls, more than 6 meters high, which looks exactly like the Iron Curtain in the Cold War, right? And so our prosperity and freedom of movement inside Europe is bought at the expense of the freedom of movement and the prosperity of people outside Europe. And for me, it's a huge moral dilemma. I don't have a perfect answer to it. I have bits of an answer. Number one, we should have safe legal routes of immigration. It's a scandal that we let people die in the Mediterranean or in the English Channel or trying to get over that fence because we don't have safe legal channels of immigration. So we should do that, like Canada. And number two, honestly, I think it's ridiculous that we spend 0.7% or less of our GDP on development aid for the rest of the world. We are still pretty rich countries in global terms. And I think the least we could do would be to spend more on development aid and look very closely at those practices of exploitation that you're talking about. But having said that, it's not an adequate answer. It remains a big, big problem.
Caroline, can you briefly answer the second question?
Second question, inadequate answer too. I think you put the finger on a big problem. I think one of the solutions could be not to just it's not just private persons who are taxed, but big multinational companies as well. And that would hopefully put a floor in some of these excesses. Although there were bankers' children protesting on the streets as well, in Paris and in other places. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
Well, first, thank you all for being here tonight. It was great to see you guys talk. It was a great discussion. It's also great to see so many people here that talk. But there's a problem because we're all political nerds, of course. But there's a large body of people who do not care as much about politics as we do. So how do we get them to care more about European politics specifically? Also with the 2024 election coming up, and as you said, we live upon an EU with a brand age where people do not know maybe the major figureheads. So do you maybe see any solutions to this problem?
I think that's
Timothy.
a question to all of us, isn't it?
Yes.
Should
Maybe
we
you
all
start.
have a go?
Yes.
It's such a great question. This may sound a bit sort of... I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, to try and bring the story of Europe home to a wider audience, right? Because as Caroline said, many books on Europe are somewhat unreadable. But I also think, and this goes to what Geert said a moment ago, that our politicians have a responsibility because they make great speeches about Europe in Brussels or elsewhere, and then they come home and blame the things that are going wrong on Brussels. The case for Europe doesn't need to be made in Brussels or in elite settings. The case for Europe needs to be made in our national languages, in the village hall, and in the pub, and in the workplace. And so I think there's also a responsibility on our political leaders to have the courage to make the case for Europe in our own national languages, in national politics, and not just, at the G20.
Geert, how should we increase interest in EU politics and politicians, you think?
I think things are changing. I'm a little bit more optimistic, also because of the crisis we had the last decade, or more than a decade, since 2008. When my first book about Europe was published in 2004, everybody said about Europe was dead. And there was not really a European discussion. And it is now almost 20 years ago, and especially after, for instance, the Greek crisis, everybody followed the Greek policies. The German refugee crisis, we followed it. There is so much changed in that way. We follow the Polish elections now. Before 2004, nobody cared. And that is really, because of this very problematic situations, we all felt we are at the end in the same boat. So it gave us a lot of problems, this crisis, but it helped us also a lot. And I think really the Union is, because of this growing crisis, because is improved much more.
Caroline?
Yeah, I agree with the two previous speakers. But again, I think something is happening already. I get a lot of mail these days from people whom I've never met, who've read a book or an article or something. They have questions and they fire those questions, and I try to answer most of them. And this is something that simply wasn't there before. I think there is you know, over the years we got more and more Europe because we asked for it. It's always at the request of the member states. We got more and more Europe, but politics remained totally national. This is now changing. I think politics is becoming a little bit more European. Why? Because Brussels is not just about the market or just about trade agreements. Brussels is also about things that were previously totally in, you know, in the national arena. Health, security, our currency, security, all these things. So everybody has an opinion about that. Everybody has strong feelings about that usually. And all of a sudden, these issues are debated on the European level. Second, most populists who were just putting all the political drama on a national podium, they've seen Brexit, they've seen Putin, they've seen Trump, they know that, you know, exit is not a good idea. So now, at least for the moment, big shift, they don't want to leave the European Union anymore. They want to stay in. Even Orban wants to stay in. They want to stay in and jump on that European podium and change Europe from the inside. I mean, it's a big challenge, I think, for all of us, but because they're on the European podium now, or stepping on the European podium, they take the drama on that European podium as well. So it becomes more interesting for people to follow it and to watch it. So I think there's really something happening there.
They embraced Zelensky, of course, also as a kind of big four provincial elections here. The leader of the Christian Democrats runs to Kiev. It takes 10 minutes of Zelensky's time. That happens too.
Quite some optimism here on the stage. So thank you, all three of you, especially Timothy, but also, of course, Caroline and Geert, for your insights this evening. There will be a signing, so Timothy will sign the book, and it's also possible to buy the book and different other books here at the desk. So thank you all for coming tonight and listening to us, and hope to see you soon.